Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Many of you have been asking that I speak about what's happening in Iran, particularly Iran and China. And now this has become very urgent because the Iranians have now announced that they might be giving the construction of Chabahar-Zahidan railway line. That is the 500-kilometer railway line from Chabahar port, in which India has a big stake, to Afghanistan's borders, which India thought would give India access to Afghanistan for its goods and trade, bypassing Pakistan and really abutting Gwadar on the other side, which was a Chinese stronghold in Pakistan. Now, if the Chinese get into Chabahar, this is obviously something with a big implication for India. So, we will talk about it today. Second thing you keep asking me about quite often is what happens with these yellow sheets. Now, I just seem to like these yellow sheets, but you know what? I am not the only one who likes them. There are some more people in my life, very important in my life, who seem to like these as well. And I will tell you what happens with these sheets. So, please stay on till the end. And while doing that, I will break a long held rule in my family. And I will tell you also what the rule is. So, please hang on till the end. Now, something has been happening between China and Iran for some time, and this started particularly after Trump began withdrawing from the nuclear deal that Obama had signed with Iran. We'll talk about that in some detail. But what is the immediate provocation? The immediate provocation is that the New York Times has come out with a big scoop. It's a sizable scoop, bylined Farnaz Fasihi and Stephen Lee Myers, whose stories we've quoted from earlier also. Now, these two have got the draft of the 18-page agreement that is to be signed between Iran and China. And it looks like, the story says, that it's been now approved by Iranian President Rouhani and also the Foreign Minister Javed Zarif. Now, this is quite a significant one. If you go over this, you can see that the 18-page draft agreement brings in China into Iran's banking, telecom, ports, railway sectors and dozens of other projects. Now, this is not all. In return for this, how is Iran going to pay? Iran is going to pay with heavily discounted oil over 25 years. Again, in return for which the Chinese will invest 400 crores in Iran in these projects. Now, why is this important and why should Iran give discounted oil to China? Most of you know it, but let me also again underline it, because Iran is under American sanctions. So, Iran can't sell its oil almost to bulk of the countries in the world. Even India used to buy quite a lot from Iran, now cannot do it for fear of American sanctions. But the Chinese have no such fear, and Chinese are big consumers of petroleum. In fact, Chinese depend right now, their guarantee for petroleum, we had mentioned it when we talked about Putin and Russia. Their guarantee is that Russia guarantees them onshore supplies of oil and gas. Once they get Iran, then that is one more assurance for them, plus cheaper prices. So, in some ways, it is like a barter trade for China. Then, as if this is not important enough, there is a strong strategic element to this agreement. Again, I quote from the New York Times story. It says on the strategic side, this implies this will involve deepening military cooperation, joint training and exercises. So far, not so bad, but go ahead. Joint research and weapon development, intelligence sharing. Now, look at the map of the region, and you will see it on my screen. Look at the map of the region and look at where Iran is, and look at where Chabahar is, and where Gwadar is, and where CPEC is coming down, and where India is, and what India's interests are. So, this is really in the very, if not the heart, then in the bowels, in the underbelly of India's strategic interests. Very important. And this is now a full-fledged strategic cooperation, or so it looks like, and the Chinese already have that with Pakistan. Then it goes on to say that objectives are to fight, quote unquote, lopsided battle with terrorism, drugs and human trafficking. The key thing is terrorism, lopsided battle. Drugs and human trafficking have I think just been added cosmetically, also hoping that this will fool others. Nobody will be fooled, everybody knows nobody will be fooled. This is about military security and terrorism. Terrorism is also a kind of camouflage for hard intelligence sharing and military ties. Now, these ideas, it's not as if these have just come up in Trump's times. These ideas were first proposed by Xi Jinping on his visit to Iran in 2016. That was a full 10 months before the American elections that brought Trump to power. But he had proposed it then, but Iran had options, because remember, Obama was reaching out to Iran because Obama was following a policy of, in a way, withdrawing America from the quagmire of the Middle East and pivoting on Asia instead. As part of that, Obama had signed his nuclear deal with Iran, which was not just about nuclear weapons, it was about a strategic shift in America's view from Middle East, from the Arab Middle East to Asia. And the idea was that Obama was taking a punt on Iran becoming a more reliable and more useful ally or partner in future than just the Arab countries, or at least balancing the Arab countries in the process. That's changing now, and that change will come to it, and I will tell you why it changed. Now, this agreement, again there are parts of this agreement which are very interesting. So, here these words, I will read them carefully from the draft. It says, two ancient Asian cultures, two partners in trade and economy, politics, culture and security with a similar outlook and many mutual, bilateral and multilateral interests will consider each other strategic partners. So, this agreement is now declaring Iran and China as strategic partners. The cynical me has to also mention that while these two ancient cultures might share strategic interests in security and cultural and trade and economic interests, they also have a very similar view on human rights, and both love to carry out death sentences. Both are champions of the world in that business. China, of course, is way ahead of Iran in that area as well. This agreement will involve China investing in 100 projects, at least in 100 projects in Iran, which essentially will become part of China's BRI, which is China's vehicle to build and protect its strategic interests in the entire Eurasian region. And this will include airports, high-speed railways, subways, free trade zones, including one in Maku in northwest Iran. Look at the map. Also, one in Abadan. Now, Abadan, if you look at the map, Abadan is where the Persian Gulf ends, or what the Arabs like to prefer to call Arabian Gulf, but globally it's still called Persian Gulf, where that ends and where the waters of Euphrates and Tigris, the two humongous rivers of the Middle East, sort of wash into the Persian Gulf. That is where Abadan is strategically located, very important refinery and oil and trading town. That is again where the Chinese will build an FTZ and other installations. Then they will also build something on an FTZ on the Gulf island. See that on the map of Keshem or Cheshem, depending on how you pronounce it. Then the Chinese will bring in their 5G into Iran. Not just that, the Chinese version of GPS, global positioning system, with its Baidu, will also come into Iran, and that might help the Iranians build the Great Firewall, both words spelled with capitals to begin with, G and F capital, the Great Firewall, just as the Chinese have done. So, which means Iran will then be in a completely different category along with China. It might be a matter of time before Pakistan also gets there. Now, the question is, could this have happened if the Americans had not pushed Iran into China's arms? Of course not, but it did happen. So, why did the Americans push Iran into China's arms? So, again we read up something. There is a wonderful columnist and writer and thinker, a great mind, Gideon Rahman, who I read often. I know him well. In fact, soon enough, I am trying to get him on our off the cuff to be chatting with us over a long interview, just as we had Francis Fukuyama, because we try and bring in the topmost minds in the world. So he wrote a book called Easternization. Check that book out if you have the time. Now, in that book, he makes some very good points, particularly about what's happened between Iran and America and China now. He says throughout the 20th century, Western nations became the dominant influence in the Middle East. So as the Ottoman Empire began to decline in the 19th century, remember we talked about about Turkey just 3 days back, and we talked about the changes in Hagia Sophia, etc. I'm also, by the way, watching on Netflix these days Ottoman, and it's quite interesting that you talk about something and you think that what happened in the past is not relevant. It's all very relevant. So he says in 19th century, as the Ottomans declined, what happened? With the First World War, as the Ottomans lost, the victors of the First World War, that is the big powers of Europe, France and Britain, they cut up the old Ottoman Empire between themselves. But after Second World War, when the Americans rose in their power, they challenged even the European domination of the Middle East. So the example is 1956, the Suez Crisis, when the Anglo-French intervention took place. The US actually frowned at it and did not let them fully have their way. After that, the US got involved very heavily in the Middle East and got invested very heavily in the Middle East, partly because there was Israel there, but also very strongly because there was the energy interest there. Much of the world's oil came from the Middle East. And that's how the Middle East became then the cradle of the first Cold War between the Soviet Union and America. So each side had their allies. The Americans had Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey and Iran to begin with. Soviet Union had Egypt, Iraq, Syria and to some extent Turkey to begin with, but then it changed over time. We know in 1973 Egypt made a switch from the Soviet bloc to the American bloc, and then the peace accords with Israel took place. Sadat paid for that change with his life. He was assassinated by one of his soldiers for that. But at the same time, or around the same time, Iran also switched from the American side because the revolution took place in Iran, and Shah of Iran, who was Western ally, he lost his power. So Iran did not immediately become an ally of Soviet Union or anybody else, but it went away from the American sphere. So those are the big changes that took place in the Middle East. Now when Obama came to power, Obama figured that this was a losing proposition. He was obviously irritated with what was happening in the Middle East. He was irritated with Netanyahu in Israel. He was also not very fond of the Gulf Cooperation Council leaders, that is the sheikhs of Saudi Arabia and UAE, etc., etc. So he in a way distanced America from the Middle East, and he cut down on American commitment to the Middle East as in the Arab world, and chose a pivot to Asia. So that pivot to Asia was often talked about. So he was looking at the other side of Asia and getting out of the jhagda, roz ka rona dhona in the Middle East. So he thought that maybe Iran, as a more stable civilizational state, there was no real percentage in having it as an enemy forever. It was a strong country, strong nationalism, lots of oil, lots of intellect, lots of creativity. So he reached out to Iran. So, but he thought that by reaching out to Iran, he'll again look more at Asia and he'll be able to take his mind away and the American policy and American emphasis away from the Middle East. But as Gideon Rahman says in his book, that it's very difficult for an American president to get away from the Middle East. And why? There's a very interesting quote in his book. In fact, he quotes a man called Philip Gordon, who was then director of Middle East in National Security Council in Washington. in Obama's second term. And he quotes him as saying that, look, you might say, the White House might say that we want to pay less attention to the Middle East. But the but White House is basically, White House is thinking and time management and time commitment is based on crisis management. And what do you do when 90% of the world's crisis actually take place in the Middle East? So obviously, while he tried to shift his attention away or his emphasis away from the Middle East, that did not happen. But he still did reach out to them. He reached out to Iran. He signed that so-called nuclear deal, not just with America, but America and P5+1. P5+1 is something you will hear about often, particularly if there is a change of presidency in America. P5 is the 5 permanent members of the UN, plus 1 in this formulation is Germany. In fact, Europeans also like to call it E3+3. That means 3 from Europe, Britain, France, Germany, and 3 from outside, that is Russia, America, and China. So P5+1 were brought in together by Obama in this agreement, and they signed with Iran what is called as JCPOA. So JCPOA is Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. That JCPOA Trump has gone back on. Why has Trump done it? Now, once again, Obama had a dislike for Gulf leaders and Netanyahu. Trump, on the other hand, loves Mohammed bin Salman. He loves the sheikhs. They are like him, he thinks. And he loves Netanyahu. So he reversed everything. Plus, he hates Obama. So he had to reverse everything that Obama had done. So the first foreign visit Trump made after becoming president was to Israel and Saudi Arabia. And then he gave such a long rope to MBS that many people think, and many experts think, and I might have some agreement with that, that if MBS had not been able to make such a presumption of Trump's help or Trump's sympathy, he would not have done to columnist Khashoggi what he did in Turkey in assassinating him that cruelly. So that is the big change Trump made, and Trump had another difference in his situation, and that was a factual difference, strong factual difference. And what was that? That now America was producing so much oil that its dependence on the Middle East was gone. In the past, in the 50s, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, the first decade of this century, there was always this trouble that America depends on China, on Middle East's oil. Now, America no longer depends on Middle East's oil. With shale gas and the rest that happened in America, particularly after Trump came in, that is not needed. Now, whether Europe suffers because of this, or Japan suffers because of this, or China suffers because of this, or India suffers because of this, is not Trump's problem, or not the problem of Trump's America. So that is what happened, and that is what all the countries in this region who will be affected by this began to look at their own interests, including India. So look at Iran. So in Iran's case, Iran's economy, and I am now quoting from articles also by one of our wonderful, smart former diplomats, Navdeed Sarna. That article is in the Hindustan Times, and all the articles I quote from, look for the links in our description. If you don't find them, just respond. I'll say sorry and we'll add it there. And also an article by Kabir Taneja on the print.in on the impact these changes will have on India. So I quote from the article. It says Iran's economy based on petroleum exports has contracted severely. Investments have dried up for fear of sanctions, and pandemic has taken a toll. Iran clearly needs a lifeline as well as international support. Now, US has not given it to them. Israel is fighting them, so they face those two clear and present enemies. A country like India can't even buy cheap oil from Iran for fear of sanctions. China is willing to provide both. Both means economic lifeline as well as international strategic support. With that, why would Iran say no to this? And then look at the implications of this. 3 implications. 1, this brings China as a player in the Middle East for the first time. So India now has to worry about that. Number 2, US, Russia and China and Turkey, in a way, these will be the four players in the region. US declining unless there is a big change of policy by the US. Then if the Chinese also get the port at a place called Jask, that is at the Gulf of Hormuz. Now if you see the Gulf of Hormuz, it is only 56 kilometers wide at its narrowest. There you take the territorial waters on both sides, so it's a very narrow channel through which a lot of the world's energy passes. It's very easy to block this. So have the Chinese there, have the Chinese in Gwadar, have the Chinese in Chabahar, have the Pakistanis as China's allies, have the Iranians as China's allies, and then you have the Chinese at Djibouti. So look at the map, it's not that far. Then you know that you have trouble, particularly India has trouble. So what is the meaning for India specifically? What it means for India is that a kind of trap around India is now shutting. India's projects in Iran are now over. It also means that for the first time in the world's strategic history, China has a leverage over one of the 7 key choke points in the world. What are these 7 key choke points? I will just list them. You can see them on the map, and we might talk about these at some other point of time. But these 7 choke points are Malacca Strait in Indian Ocean between Malaysia and Indonesia. At its narrowest, it's about 800 plus kilometers. So not that narrow, but narrow. But remember, India's Nicobar Islands reach almost the other end of Malacca Strait. So India has a strategic position there. The Chinese are always worried about that. Number 2 is the Gulf of Hormuz, where the Chinese will now be sitting, and I spoke about that just now. That is the Middle East. Third is Suez Canal. Once again, look at the map. Suez Canal is crucial because it links the Mediterranean with the Red Sea. Panama Canal, that's far away. It links the Atlantic and the Pacific. I'm just listing the 7 choke points for you. Strait of Bosporus in Turkey. It's also called the Turkey Strait. This is what makes Turkey so interesting. Half in Europe, half in Asia. In fact, if you go to Istanbul, you can sit on one coast and see European coast and see Asia on the other, and take a few minutes boat ride to go to the other end. And frankly, it does feel very different. It feels like Asia and Europe for some reason. It's the same city. It's like the Jamna in Delhi. So eastern Delhi and the other parts of Delhi. It's not much wider than that either. So Strait of Bosporus. Then 3 Danish straits connecting the North Sea with the Baltics. Then the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. Bab el-Mandeb is the gateway from Suez through to the east coast of Africa. Basically, it connects Red Sea to Gulf of Aden. Once again, if the Chinese are sitting at the Gulf of Hormuz with Iran, Chabahar with Iran, Gwadar with Pakistan, Djibouti with their own base, you can imagine how close the Chinese are also strategically to this area. So if you look at all of this, you know that the global strategic picture is now changing. And the only next thing we have to look at is, first, how does it go between China and Iran? You can see that India has been edged out of there. You can see that what the Chinese had, their string of pearls around India might have one more, which may go out of India's pocket. That's Iran. I am not saying it will, but it might, because India's leverage is limited. Now, having said that, I made a promise to you and I told you I'll break a family rule. So the rule in our family is that we never feature anywhere in my writing, my speech, or on social media, any member of our family. And for us, even the dogs and cats we have, quite a few of them are members of our family. And you keep asking me about what happens to these yellow pages. So I'll share a tiny clip with you. Please watch, and watch these 4 friends of mine who like these yellow pages as well, and who wait for me to finish often, and then I happily and gratefully give these to them, and you can see what they do to them.